Let's talk a little bit about the MVC pattern, and MVC stands for Model View Controller. MVC is a pattern seen in software development in general that breaks code out into different responsibilities. And by doing this, we have a separation of concerns. And so why exactly would we want to break our code out like this? Well, if you've ever spent any time working on a large application that doesn't have any kind of separation, what you'll find is that things get kind of strung together in a single file or maybe a few files that get really large, and it becomes really difficult to reason about what the code is doing. If instead we introduce some kind of organization to the code and have things more contained within smaller units, then it becomes a lot easier to work on. And this is especially true if you're working in a large team. The more people you add to a team, the more hands you've got in a code base, and ultimately it becomes a little bit difficult to keep track of everything if you don't have a good pattern to follow for organizing code. That's probably the biggest benefit to using MVC, but there are other purposes as well. MVC helps us to have dry code, don't repeat yourself, which means our code is more reusable. And all around, if used properly, MVC can save us time in the long run. Okay, so let's talk about the individual components of MVC. And just to note that definitions around MVC tend to vary from place to place. There's a lot of different opinions about MVC, and people tend to have differing views on it. But we'll go with kind of the most commonly seen definition. In an application context, the model is often thought of as the piece that is responsible for communicating with a backend or a database, and then delivering results from a backend to the application. The view is the code that makes up what the user actually sees on their screen. And what the user will see, most often, will be some content that is retrieved from the database. And so there needs to be some way to communicate between the model and the view. The model is getting data from the database, and the view is displaying it. And the piece that makes that happen is the controller. The controller's responsibility is to communicate between the model and the view. So our views will very often have some place for user input. The controller would grab that user input from the view and then would pass it off to the model to be sent to the database, and vice versa. The model would retrieve some data from the database, send it to the controller, and the controller would pass it to the view. And the reason for this middleman controller is because quite often we will need to do some work before sending values to the model to be persisted in the database. Or likewise, we might need to do some work on some data that's retrieved from the database before passing it to the view. And the controller is a place where we can do that. So like we talked about, there are many different opinions on what exactly MVC means and how it works out, and there's a lot of opinions on what the best practice is around separating concerns for code as well. And for that reason, there's actually quite a few variants of the MVC pattern. We've got MVP, which is Model View Presenter. We've got MVVM, which is Model View View Model. And the Angular team has actually come out in the past and said that it's agnostic about that last letter. So Angular is actually an MV star framework, which is MV whatever. And that means whatever works as that last letter for the developer. All right, so that's all pretty theoretical for now, but we're going to get a good look at how this works once we get started in the application.